Hello, welcome to this super special podcast with Dr. Mahesh Bhalgat, the Group MD and CEO of Veeda Lifesciences. Dr. Mahesh Bhalgat is an accomplished professional with more than 3 decades of experience in the field of clinical research and development. He has led large teams in organizations like Sanofi and Syngene, and in Veeda, he is leading a transformational change where Veeda Life Sciences is now going global. He has 3 decades of experience in designing go to market approaches, developing strategies, and spearheading multiple initiatives across functions in large scale organizations. For his vast experience and deep expertise, he has won many accolades and awards, not just from India but from across the world. Friends, today we are going to talk about Veda's journey to become a global company, a true life science global enterprise that Dr. Mahesh Bhalgat is leading from front. He is leading this transformation from the inside and taking this company on a global stage where a lot is changing. So, we are going to talk about how the drug development clinical research industry has changed over the past few decades and what does the future look like, and many other interesting things that is shaping Veeda Life Sciences that we know today. So, it's going to be a very interesting conversation. Let's just get to it. Dr. Mahesh, welcome to the show. Thank you so much for accepting the invite. I want to talk a lot about clinical research as an industry, clinical trials, how the new treatments are developed, and what goes behind, and how the industry across the world is looking like, and what the future does look like. Right. But before that, if you can just tell us about your recent experiences, and if you can give us a glimpse of your journey very quickly, and then we'll start with the industry related questions.
First of all, thank you very much for having me on your show. I'm really delighted to do this conversation with you. Speaking of my journey, I've always been interested in doing something that is related to healthcare. And now that I'm in the field of clinical trials, this is absolutely about making an impact to patient lives by bringing them newer therapies and newer medicines. So, in a very, very exciting space that is changing quite dramatically and something that is impactful. My journey has been about always being in the pharmaceutical industry. I've spent about 35 years now relating to bringing medicines, whether innovative, whether generics, or through services or through products, but always being related to the pharmaceutical industry.
So some professions, apart from everything that any profession would give, gives sense of satisfaction because you're adding for the betterment of the mankind, right? Is that the case for you here, having been associated with the pharma industry for so long?
Absolutely, absolutely. As a child, I never wanted to be a doctor, but I still wanted to impact lives. And what better way to do this? Which is why I did my undergraduate in pharmacy. And I said, well, this is about designing drugs, bringing drugs to the market, helping patients ultimately through the goodwill that you can do. So this is absolutely about making a difference.
Right. Okay. There would be a part of audience, right, for who even the topic, right, would be a little alien or would be news, right? So for them, if we can very quickly explain to them what goes behind developing a new therapy, right? How the clinical trials work, right, and the therapies and the medicines that we consume, right? What goes behind in developing them?
Yeah. So fortunately for me, COVID has made my life a little easier in that sense. We've now gotten used to and understood a lot more of the words that normally people wouldn't have understood, which is clinical trials, testing, newer therapies, mRNA vaccines, so on and so forth. But roughly, if we go through the journey to bring a drug to the market takes 10 to 12 years. It's a very long drawn journey where you start out with hundreds or thousands of molecules, go through and sift through them, trying to almost find a needle in a haystack, ultimately what becomes a drug. In the process, you go and say, well, I want something that will go and modify something in my body. How do I find what is that something that needs to be modified? What can I use to modify it? Then test that at a very small scale in the laboratory, perhaps sometimes test that in animal models, and then move on to testing that in humans. In humans, also, we have three different phases of testing: phase one, phase two, phase three. After which you submit all of this data that has been generated over the 10, 12 years that it takes to the regulatory agencies of the world, who then approve you and then give you the marketing authorization to bring these drugs to patients. So, a very long drawn journey, starting with a very, very large funnel of many different possibilities, ending up with one that can ultimately be in your hand and make a difference to you in the well being that you have after you take that drug.
So if you go back in the history, how old this science is, right? I mean, I had read somewhere that clinical trials or modern medicines have come to the fore for the last 200 to 250 years, right? So how did the history look like?
It's interesting that you asked that question, because if we go back and look at medicine in general, there were different approaches to medicines that are there even in the Indian mythology or in Greek mythology and so on, right? Going back to almost 3,300 years ago, of when people used to use some way of getting treatments done. Modern medicine, however, as you said, has evolved in the last few centuries. Most importantly, we have to recognize some of the key transformations that have happened. One being led by what is called as the germ theory, which is where you understand how you want to treat infectious diseases that come from infectious agents like bacteria, viruses, and so on. A major change that has happened in that was introduction of vaccines, right? In the late 18th century is when major developments happened in vaccines. There was vaccines for polio, there were vaccines for other viruses, there were vaccines that came up through the work that Pasteur has done, through the work that Jenner has done, including the smallpox vaccines. That's been transformative. The other major change that is there of use of things like insulin as a treatment. Now, insulin as a treatment is not more than 100, 102 years old. And so modern medicine that has evolved has also gone through different phases of treatments, all the way from conducting initial treatments like even incisions or surgeries without the use of anesthesia to introduction of anesthesia. Each of these transformations have given us the ability to treat patients better, right? Some being proactive like vaccines, some being very reactive like surgical interventions, but now improved through anesthesia. And then some that are of a completely different nature, where you get an agent in the body that actually works on some of the cells and not other, which is infectious agent treatments or even cancer therapeutic treatments. So large journey, very diverse. If you look at, in fact, the most recent changes in medicine that have happened, we started with what used to be called as small molecule synthetically made chemical drugs. Those are the pills that you typically think of as paracetamol or your aspirin or any of those sorts of things. From there, we've now transitioned into biological medicines. Again, COVID got us familiarized with what is called as antibody cocktails or antibodies, which are biological medicines, much larger in size, differently used for treatment, differently used in manufacturing, to where we've now gone to personalized medicine. We've gone to personalized medicine, that is where the treatment involves taking your own cells, modifying your cells, and putting them back in your body to do something better. That's the evolution that we've gone through in medicine.
So do treatments also evolve with time, or most of the efforts or innovations go into developing new treatments, right? Or do companies like Veeda, or let's say even other pharmaceutical companies, when they develop new treatments, do they also focus on evolving the treatments that are already available, right, for let's say longest years?
Absolutely. In fact, as you talk about it, Veeda, for example, does a lot of work in bringing improved medicines to the market as well, which is where, let us say that there is a drug that is being given 3 times a day. If the formulator is developing a version that is going to be taken only once a day, which is now better for you as a patient to not have to worry about taking something 3 times a day, but only once a day, that does require a trial, that does require a study that is done. And then Veeda facilitates the design of the study, the execution of the study, ultimately generating the data to show that this version of the drug is just as effective in providing the kind of therapeutic effect that you wanted, the kind of relief that you wanted in your condition, and ultimately then getting that approved. So that improvement of existing drugs either in the way that they get delivered or in the way that they work from a longer term perspective or from an ease of administration perspective, are all the things that Veeda facilitates by working with the pharmaceutical companies to making sure that those treatments are effective and therefore can be brought ultimately to patients after sufficient testing.
So you've had leadership positions, right? I mean, so you are right now at the helm of Vida. Prior to that, you were heading a big team, right, as the chief operations officer in Syngene. Right. I want to understand from you. Of course, clinical trials or developing new treatments is must be very challenging, right? So I want to understand the most difficult barriers in developing new treatments. What troubles you the most?
I think the hardest part in the drug discovery and drug development journey is the willingness to have patience, right? Because as I said, it takes a very long time to go through this entire cycle. With patience come a certain number of other requirements. One is sufficient deep pockets and funding. And therefore, this is an ecosystem that has to develop for the environment to continue to bring new drugs to the market, and for us as a company that facilitates this journey to be very effective. So you need funding, you need a good deep pocket to actually invest in this journey. You then need partners like us. Vida plays a very critical role. Even after you found a drug and you think that this drug is going to be effective, there's a certain number of places you have to test it. Like the first is the lab testing, the additional maybe what is called a safety assessment or preclinical testing, and then the clinical testing. So Vida participates with its partners, with its clients in all of these phases of testing to make sure along the way that it's effective. Now, what else do you need? Of course, is good talent, right? To conduct and design these experiments, first of all, understanding what the drug was designed for, then designing the study to actually evaluate whether that drug was effective, then further looking and seeing whether or not that drug is actually better than something that's already on the market or at least comparable and is adding some benefit. All of these are places where it's a partnering approach that Vida brings in with the partners, which are the pharmaceutical companies that are developing these drugs, to make this an effective ecosystem. And frankly, this all starts with the recognition that we are going after a major treatment improvement that we want to do. And all of these pieces then fit in. The government has a role to play in it by providing funding, the mechanism for regulatory approvals. The academic field has a piece of it to provide innovation in terms of newer treatments, newer ways of discovering newer targets. The pharmaceutical companies and then the service providers like us, making it all work together at the end of the day.
So now Vida Life Sciences has gone global, right? What does this milestone mean for you?
I think this is a very important milestone, and it go and in fact I'll start with even the previous part of the question that you mentioned. At the helm of Vida, coming from a Syngene kind of an organization, is quite a different challenge because of the fact that in this environment, which is a service environment, you have the opportunity to work with a lot of different clients and with a lot of different therapies that are being worked on. When you compare whether it's the size of the team that is in a large organization like Syngene or Amgen or some of these other companies that I've been a part of versus Vida, what's really important is maintaining the focus of serving your client needs and understanding that you're going to do it through strong science, a very heavy dose of quality and compliance that is going into it. So as you keep this focus, then you recognize that what you want is a very strong team that you have built around yourselves, who are industry leaders in understanding the contribution that they're going to bring in, whether it is in pure technical ways or it is in supporting ways. We run a very large team of project managers. So project management is something that's done in many industries. However, Vida looks at it as project management is absolutely at the core of how the customer experience is going to be, how effective we are going to be in meeting our timelines and our delivery commitments. Of course, then we have the scientific community that actually works with whether it is patients, whether it is healthy volunteers, whether it is the lab equipment, whether it is the scientists that are working in the lab, to make all of that gel together and bring that out as a value added component of what our customers get. So ultimately, it's a combination of many different elements and agents that you put together to come up with this recipe of success when you're in the service industry. And that's what we've realized, especially at Veeda, that this is about making sure you understand where the customer or the client is coming from and what is it that they're seeking out from you.
So now that Vida has gone global, right? You operate across different geographies, right? You have a representation in Europe. You have your facilities, I think, at about 27 locations, right? So when you're operating across the globe in a way, right? Of course, it must be very challenging because different geographies come with different kinds of challenges. The authorities react in a different way, right? The culture is different everywhere, right? The regulations, the medical regulations, and even data regulations in places like Europe are very different than what we have here. And you're leading this transformation being in India. How does that work?
Yeah, good question again. The global nature of our organization is where I see as it's about the standard base that you want to operate with. What is your standard base? It's about customer satisfaction. It's about customer alignment. Everything else then is, of course, variations that come in. As you said, cultures are different. It's unusual that an Indian company goes and buys a European company and then acquires that asset, integrates that within your working style, within the kind of setup that you have, so that now you're providing a much better experience. Historically, we've always thought of it as the acquisitions happen from the west to the east. This is now an era of where we are doing acquisitions from east to the west, and we are spending a lot of time, frankly, integrating the cultures. We're spending a lot of time in making sure that the companies that we have bought in the past and that we will acquire in the future as well are going to be integrated in a way that it's a seamless experience to our customers. In that, recognizing again the talent that comes with the cultural diversity that is there, but the scientific expertise has to be all blended in together. Therefore, what we are doing is making sure that we have teams that are now formed of where they are cross country. We make sure that kind of experience that our customers are going to get. Even for the example that I gave, project management, it's not just a project manager for a European client that is coming from Europe or an Indian client that is coming from India. It's actually cross serving, so that you start to understand better, you start to work better in these different dimensions and contribute to each other. There's also complementarity of skills that come in. In some cases, you recognize that the skill set of our teams in Europe, and in fact, our teams within Europe also are quite divergent. We tend to think of it as everything can meet all of the requirements of this industry, but that's not really the case. Let's talk about the kind of trials that we're doing. Oncology, as large as a space as that is, that has its own specializations. So we have experts even within Europe who may be focused more on the hemato-oncology type cancers. And then there are others who may be focused on other types of expertise and experiences. So it's constantly recognizing that you have this diverse mix of base from the talent pool that you have when you're a global organization. And therefore, how do you leverage that global organization to meet the customer needs is in fact a challenge, but an interesting one.
So you mentioned that before COVID-19, treatments used to take about 10 to 12 years to develop, especially vaccine-like treatment, right? With COVID, I think COVID vaccines were developed in matter of months, right? So is that space still that accelerated, or it has gone back to normal, or has COVID transformed the way trials happen, or medical treatment development happens?
I think it's important to first understand the COVID-19 base a little bit. When we say that, yes, we got treatments done as rapidly, there was a lot of energy that was being put into it. There was a lot of resources that were being put into it. And there were a lot of things therefore that could happen simultaneously with the amount of work that was going on, right? So even before you had step A completed, you were starting to think and plan for step B. You were probably even initiating step B, and so on and so forth. And I think that level of coordination with the kind of governmental support, the cross-country collaboration that was happening, that was of course unique for those times. And I think we do need to look for ways that will continue to bring that level of collaboration so that we can bring that speed. But the other part of what has happened is mRNAs, for example, were being studied for many, many years. So it's not a new science that came to light only after the COVID-19 pandemic. It was building up a number of years of experience. The vaccines that were not the mRNA vaccines, but the other type of vaccines that were brought in were also known as vaccine types. Now they had to be modified to be used for COVID-19, but there was a base that was there. And I think going forward, for acceleration of clinical research, for acceleration of drug research, we need to be again on those collaborative platforms. How do we bring in that much data that is there historically to limelight, to a sharing platform that everybody can benefit from? In COVID-19, one of the things that happened that was a big enabler was publishing the sequence of the virus within days after it was formed and available to everyone to design vaccines against it. That is data sharing at a completely different level, both from a speed and openness perspective. Those are the kinds of things that we need to continue to have, enabling the speed at which research can happen.
So you mean to say that COVID was a special scenario, and because of that, the collaboration was accelerated, right? The data was being shared that swiftly, but that is not the case right now. Uh, but the industry can work in that direction to make it more collaborative and better and faster.
Absolutely. There are, and today there's also very many disparate sources of data. Data platforms are not all uniform. The data sharing components are not so standardized. There is GDPR requirements, there's HIPAA requirements, all of these sort of come in. And governments need to interact, governments need to enforce the implementation of more and more scientific research that can be shared, which can lead to a completely different level of collaboration and ultimately acceleration.
So one of the reasons why collaboration was that swift and accelerated, because it was a pandemic, and the entire world was in the state of crisis, and that is when governments start taking it seriously, right? Is that the case still? Do the governments of different countries take clinical trials, treatment development that seriously now, or is that in one of their top priorities? uh,
So if you, the US FDA, for example, if you look at that as an example of a regulatory agency that is driving the need for inclusion of diversity in clinical trials. What does that mean? That means when a clinical trial is being designed, please don't design that clinical trial with only a certain population in mind. Design it with the world population in mind so that you come to know whether this drug is effective or does it have some challenges in one kind of population versus the other. And I think that's a great way to progress, because that then helps you collect a lot of data in one go and make the drug available to different parts of the world. Again, speeding up drug access, speeding up medical provisions for the entire world. So I think that's the kind of change and that's the kind of collaboration that needs to happen. Now, it's not always easy to design such a trial, what we call as a diversity based trial. Even though the regulatory agencies might ask for it, it's not always easy to implement. That's again where Veeda comes in. So Veeda is making a difference by now our presence, as you said, is global. We have recruitment sites that are there in 26 countries. We are using our offices that are present both in Europe and in India to bring that opportunity of closing the diversity loop on trials, whereby we can design a trial that has a component of the population that's coming from America, a component of the population that's coming from, let's say, Latin America, as well as from Europe, Asia, India, of course, and therefore bringing you a much more diverse trial, giving you a lot more insights on how the drug is working in different populations, therefore, again, speeding up the way that trials can be conducted and the way that new drugs can be approved.
Sir, how, I'm asking this for my curiosity. How easy or difficult it is to get diverse group of people as patients?
It's not easy. Very plain, simply, it's not easy, right? Because there are many different ways in which medical systems work. There are very different ways in which the patient or the medicine access works. If we take the example of a country like India, I think it's easier to do clinical trials in India from one perspective. Why? because newer therapies don't come to India that fast. So therefore, as if a patient was offered a newer therapy as part of a clinical trial, and with all of the understanding of that this is still investigational, they may be much more willing to say that I don't have access to another medicine, let me try that medicine. On the other hand, in a country where the access to drugs is provided by payer-based systems, there it's the payers that are deciding whether or not you can get access to a certain medicine, or whether or not you are eligible and a suitable candidate for that kind of a trial. Therefore, differentiating whether or not a person from a certain part of the world versus another part of the world would be willing to participate in such a diversity based trial. So, you want to design that trial, but there are a number of different considerations that come into it. See, this is where we are actually making a difference also by approaching this from a technology platform perspective. So, in Veeda, we use an AI platform that works on real world data, that looks at patient information and matches that with the clinical trial design to say, is there a certain population that is most suited for this trial, and how can we access that population so that it's a win-win, right? Only the most appropriate, suitably identified patients with a certain history, certain requirement for how the drug was designed are actually the ones where the testing is done as well. So it's a patient matching platform that we do based on real world data on an AI platform, leading to again improvement of speed and execution in the clinical trials.
Okay. Sir, what would be the contribution of India in the global clinical research landscape? How important is India, if I can phrase it, in a little different way? How important is India for the global clinical research landscape? What is our contribution?
So let me give you two pieces of information and data on that, right? If phase 2, phase 3 trials, there were roughly less than 50 trials that were being done of that nature, of that specific nature in India in 3 years back. That number has now gone up, less than 50 has now gone up to roughly 150. So you can say almost a threefold increase in number of trials that India is participating in. But from a global landscape perspective, that number is actually still very small. The total number of the total percentage of trials where India is represented is in the range of about 5 to 6% at the most. So, being a very large contributor with our population of 1.4 billion, where we are about 18 to 20% of the world's population, you can start to now see that there's a lot more opportunity for India to actually be represented in clinical trials, which actually is a win-win both for the development of the drug as well as for the Indian patients, because that brings access to Indian patients with Indian data a lot faster. But today there's still a lot more way to go before India is a key contributor to this whole space.
That Vida uses AI, right? And it was a bit surprising that AI and machine learning kind of advanced technologies have a role to play in drug development process, right? So I want to understand that a little deeper. If you can elaborate on that.
Yeah, so let me give an example of where AI is actually impacting in many different ways. Some ways, of course, like I mentioned, that Vida is already utilizing in, but let's back up a little bit. Today, AI is being used to do drug design itself. When AI is being used to design new drugs, there's already in mind a patient population that this drug is going to be suitable for. That is what data, and that correlation is what is used even then eventually in the stages of development as you take the drug forward, which is where Vida comes in one of the stages of doing the clinical trials or even the preclinical work, as I said, and therefore matching that with the expectation from the design perspective to the execution perspective. In addition, in fact, there are other places that we are evaluating the use of data now, and this is still in early stages but will eventually happen, which is to use digital twins and have a part of the population of the clinical trial that might even come from digital patients, so that you don't use your entire population, This is still very, very early stages, so this is not something implemented. So you start to look at all the information that you have about how the human body works and starts to create a digital twin. So we've all heard about this term called digital twin, right? A digital twin you can have of a small process or a small operation in a, let's say, in a manufacturing floor. This is about understanding and representing how your body works in a certain state of normalcy, and therefore predicting that if a drug was given to a person who is of this kind of a normal thing, what would happen. You start to break down every single element of a human body and a human operation to try and predict that. Now, once you get to be really good at that, imagine what can happen. You can start to say, well, in a patient that has this function that is not working so well, or this enzyme that is less, or that protein that is less, or this antibody that is not working in a given patient, what would happen? You start to mimic that in an in silico, as the word that they use for this kind of a term is, in that way, to then design and say, well, I can now predict before I actually did my entire trial. I can predict what's going to happen. It's going to help you design your trials better. It's going to help you reduce the number of actual life patients that you need as well.
So this is really exciting and also surprising. What are the other revolutionary approaches that are developing, emerging, to find new therapies? Apart from, let's say, use of advanced technologies, from medical science perspective, right?
Yeah, I think one of the things that we have to talk a little bit about is precision medicine. Right. So precision medicine is becoming a very, very futuristic thing that is now already there. So it's futuristic, but we're already starting to see the fruits of that. There's a whole space called cell and gene therapy. For those of the folks who are not familiar with something like that, it's about understanding that you may need to have a certain gene in your body, in your DNA, to be fixed because that's the gene that is not somehow not working well or was not working well from the very beginning. And that can be the case in what we call as some of the genetic disorders. So now to rewire or to redesign the DNA of a person, individual, is personalized treatment. What's the earliest step of that? Is to understand biomarkers in the body, which can help design the treatment for that person. So if you say, well, certain person has a deficiency of X or an excess of Y, and therefore are the suitable candidates to get that medicine. Nobody else needs to get that medicine because it's not really designed for somebody. Now you start to say, well, let's identify whether that person who has X disease is because of the deficiency of X. If it is because of deficiency of X, that's the only treatment that they would get. That's now starting to get into what's called as biomarker-based interventions, which is the first step of precision medicine. The next step of precision medicine is then taking the cells of a person's body, modifying them in some way, shape, or form. Oftentimes, it is about making them more active to fighting, especially cancer or any other disease, so that your own immune system is now rewired or reprogrammed to fight disease. Very exciting. Lots of things happening in such spaces as well. There is even more interventions. We heard of mRNA vaccines. There is now a whole field of medicine that is called siRNA, if you will, which can again reduce the frequency at which somebody needs to get treatment as well. So now, a number of different things that are happening in the world of medicine that we'll continue to see as evolution.
So talking about India, India is looked upon as an alternative to China by a lot of industries, right? I'm assuming that that would be the case here also in clinical research. So I want to understand, when it comes to biosimilars and biologics, right, and also other treatments, how India is winning over China. Number one, and second is how are we expanding these innovations globally, starting from India.
Yeah. So I think, let's talk about biosimilars, because or biological medicines. India has the knowledge base and the investments that are done to build this kind of an industry and a platform. Now, we always talk about China and India as one of the key differentiators is on the scale at which China operates. So, India's presence is very much there in the whole biologics sector and is, in fact, a leading developer of biosimilars. Now, for that whole environment, again, to move forward progress, Veeda has a role to play. One, because Veeda has a facility that actually helps the development of biological drugs, or what we call as biopharmaceuticals and biosimilars as well. So Veeda brings that element of participation, benefiting from the whole India ecosystem, because in India itself, this whole trend of biological medicine is picking up, where it can now start to compete on the scale and on the technological advances with some of the other parts of the world, including China. The other part that Veeda is also contributing to, and again helping the whole ecosystem in India, which is ultimately beneficial for us to compete with countries like China, is with regards to the capacity of doing newer research. And so in Veeda, we focus not just on, in the biologics group, we focus not just on biosimilars, but we also focus on novel biologics, which means new entities that can be either developed or manufactured or both from India. And so Veeda is contributing to that aspect of the value chain by providing its own facilities for biologics development, both analytical and process development, as well as doing assay development work that can help you analyze samples that come after clinical research is done. So once a clinical trial is done, there are samples that are collected and they need to be analyzed. Veeda is also taking the forefront on analysis of those samples coming from biological or biosimilar trials, which in itself is going to help this field and therefore help India take a bigger stance and a better world leadership position, if you will, versus China, versus some of the other parts of the world.
So, in most of the cases, right, the development, right, in clinical research flows from west to east, right? And you also mentioned in this conversation earlier that it's easy to get patients here in India comparatively to the west, because the patients may not have all the advanced therapies, right, that are available in the west. So, I want to understand why is this difference and how the industry can ensure that the advanced and new treatments are available globally to everyone.
So I think it is about the way that drug development happens, right? There's a drug development objective. In fact, if we go into a slightly more technical term, there's what is called as a target product profile. When somebody is designing a drug, they have a target product profile that they start with. That target product profile has a component of which is the population that I want to market this drug in first. And typically, with the kinds of research that has been done and the kind of companies that are leading in in pharmaceutical research, the first objectives would be is to market these drugs in some of the Western countries where they're developed. So by definition, what happens is the target is that particular part of the world, which is the Western world. Now, for that to change, of course, a lot has to change, right? One, we need to start doing more innovation in India, and I believe that many of the Indian pharmaceutical companies are looking at that. We, as industry forums, often talk about that as how do we move India from being a pharmacy of the world, where it is a volume leader but not a value leader? How do we go from volume to value, which will come through interventions of getting more and more into drug research in India, bringing that innovation of drug research into India, which will then ultimately bring newer therapies to India earlier and faster. However, for that to happen, Indian companies, of course, need to start looking at that as something that is essential, spending more investment in that area, the government doing more interventions, but also our regulatory system. Our regulators also need to adapt to that framework of where more innovative research, more novel drug research, more new drug research is happening and coming to India. And by definition, when you're working on a new drug, you don't have as much information about that drug. And so, therefore, you're going to want a lot more data and a lot more information before you can say, yes, it's okay to go ahead and either manufacture that drug, test it in lab facilities, or test it in human beings. So, it needs many of these elements that actually need to come together for the propelment of innovation, as we call innovative research, and therefore more drugs coming into India earlier and faster.
Sir, how does the future look like for Veeda now that Veeda is going to be Veeda Life Sciences? Tell us a bit about that.
Yeah, so Veeda is going through an interesting journey. We are rebranding to Veeda Life Sciences. It's not just rebranding, we're actually transforming. We are moving from the historical business that Veeda has had, which is about running healthy volunteer studies, which is about working with generic drugs, to now doing more patient based studies, which is doing clinical trials and doing that with innovator drugs. So we are transforming from generics to innovator. We are transforming from small molecules to large molecules, and we are transforming from being an India-centric healthy volunteer business to a global patient study-based business. It's going to be quite transformational for us in the years to come. We're also looking at the space of biologics very importantly. And that's where we've started a division that's called biologics or biopharma, that is catering to the biologics industry in terms of offering them services such as analytical development, process development, what we call as some of these important components of cell line development and enablers to make sure that biologics drugs come to the market faster and more efficiently. So, really moving forward in many of these transformational changes under the name brand of Veeda Life Sciences. So, really excited about that transformation. I think it's going to be very good. It's going to be very good for the patients that we ultimately serve and for the customers and the partners that we work with through this entire transformation.
Sir, how does it feel like being at the helm of Veeda, especially at this point of transformation?
I think this is exciting times. I can't give this experience up for anything else. We have a fantastic team working with us, and I'm delighted to see all the talent that we've been able to acquire when we did the acquisition of the European company that brings us into much more limelight with regards to oncology based clinical trials. The team that we have in Ahmedabad and the team that we have in Bangalore, all of this put together is an exciting time to lead and bring innovative medicines to the forefront. I think what excites me the most about this journey is the fact that we are continuing to bring a difference to the patients ultimately, although we are not the ones who are actually making the drugs. And this is what the team recognizes. This is where they say, well, ultimately, quality is going to be very important, speed is going to be very important, because we are in the way making and enabling drugs coming to the human population. What a phenomenal contribution that you can do.
So throughout this conversation, this is my last question. Throughout the conversation, right, I see a lot of optimism in you, and there are a lot of possibilities that you talked about, right? So I want to understand where the clinical research space would go in the next 5 to 10 years. How does the future look like in India as well as globally?
I think if there's one word to describe the transformation that clinical research will have is data. Data is going to rule a lot of what we do in the future. Whether it is some drugs where we get so much knowledge that you actually don't even need to do a study anymore because it's a generic version of something that's already on the market. So we have enough information about it. As long as we look at the purity profile, the impurity profile, all of the things that you can do in the laboratory, you can go with data and say, and that's happening even today, of course, with certain number of drugs, but we'll see more and more of that because there is more data explosion that we are going through. The other aspect of data is in the design of clinical trials. We're going to use data to design trials better, with better endpoints, with better understanding of which patients we should actually enroll in that trial and what is the probability of success of that. The additional element of data that's going to come in with regards to especially the whole space of clinical trials is how we process that data. Today, we have a certain number of design components that we take into consideration in our clinical trials. As we work with more and more data, we'll be able to optimize that better, which then makes the design of that clinical trial and the interpretation of that clinical trial even more stronger. as the world explodes into what we call as the large language learning models or other models that are used to processing data, clinical trials will become more efficient. So, and it's important because when you talk about precision medicine, doing a clinical trial for precision medicine is very different than doing a clinical trial for a regular medicine, where clinical precision medicine is designed for a certain set or a certain individual. Now you have to start taking that into consideration, and all of that is going to be optimized to the use of data.
So thank you so much for spending this time with us. This has been really enriching and enlightening conversation. Thank you so much.
Lovely. I've enjoyed every moment of it. Thank you very much.